Hi, I am Isaac Stewart. I'm here with Michael Whelan and Brandon Sanderson. I am Brandon's art director here at Dragonsteel Entertainment. Brandon, of course, writes the books and many other things, and we have Michael Whelan, who is an amazing illustrator. He does the covers for the Stormlight books, among many other things throughout the years. He's one of the most decorated fantasy, imaginative realism illustrators of our time. And we're glad to be here with him to talk about art and specifically the Stormlight books and the art that goes in those. So I'll give you each a chance to say hi. And
hello.
And Michael.
Thanks for this invitation and opportunity. I appreciate it.
Well, we're glad that you're able to make it and make some time for us. We really appreciate that. So I'm going to throw out some questions here to kind of get us just chatting about art and the books.
Okay.
So first off, how did you get started doing the Stormlight covers for Tor and Brandon?
I was at a convention and as an artist guest of honor, and Tom Doherty was a publisher guest of honor at the convention. And at the banquet, he was sitting next to me and he grabbed onto my arm with two hands. And he said, "I'm going to hold on to you and I'm not going to let go unless you agree to do a cover for me." And I said, "Tom, I know I've been promising for years, but I just haven't been able to make it, dent in my schedule. But just because of this event, yes, I'll do something, but I have one request: make it a science fiction book and not a fantasy book." And he said, "No problem. I'll send you a science fiction manuscript, and boy, it'd be great if you could do a cover for a Tor." And I liked working with Irene Gallo, and I've had a good relationship with Tom over the years, so it was no hardship on my part to make room in my schedule for it. When the manuscript came, though, it was this huge box, and I opened it up, and I started reading it and realized that this isn't science fiction at all. And I was dismayed at first, but 25 pages into the first draft of The Way of Kings, I was absolutely hooked. I thought, I just couldn't stop reading it. And I raced through what material I had and then went back and started again the second time. And I can't remember if I called up Irene or Tom, but I said, "I know I'd asked for a science fiction book, but this is one of the best fantasy novels I've ever read. This is terrific, and it's so full of wondrous things to illustrate. The visuals on every page in this book are so compelling that this is something I'm really looking forward to." So I was very excited to do the assignment, and it was a labor of love.
That's partially my fault, Michael. About the time when he was getting ready to send you that book, I'm sure he had a science fiction book in mind, but I had just gone in to Tor and done a big pitch on the Stormlight archive, which Tom had not known about before that, and the whole pitch's job was to convince him to get you for the cover. And so I did like an hour pitch to him and Irene with storyboards and concept art from Ben McSweeney and stuff to try to get them on board. And at the end I said, "And what I want you to do is get me Michael Whelan." And Tom's like, "Well, he did just promise to do a cover for me." So that's why you got that box. I kind of co-opted that offer that you had kindly given to him. I didn't know he had been promised. I didn't know you'd been promised a science fiction book till years later. But I did. I was in the right place at the right time.
Yeah, well, for both of us, it worked out really well.
And The Way of Kings, really, if you look at like the ecology and stuff, it does remind me of something like Dune, right? Which is really thought out, and even though it's a that's a science fiction and yours is a fantasy. I think there's some overlap in the fantasy as far as it does have some science fictional elements in a way.
Yeah, one of the fundamental ideas behind the Stormlight archive was to do a fantasy with science fiction style world building. And to really, I'd always felt that fantasy could push a little further on its world building and learn some lessons from the great science fiction books. And when I broke in, that was one of my main goals, was to do a big fantasy epic that felt like a science fiction. Just like Dune is a science fiction that feels like a fantasy in a lot of its plotting, but it's science fiction world building, I wanted something with that same sort of feel. And so there is, if you're going to do a fantasy book, this is the most science fiction-y fantasy book that probably is there was a chance to do.
I think that's well put, because that was my sense right from the get-go, that you had such a complete vision of the ecology and the way that the different animals, the flora and fauna of Roshar interact with their environment, and everything has a logical quality to it that speaks well about how well you've thought it out, and it's consistent. So it feels very science fiction-y in that respect. I think that's very well put. I had that sense right from the beginning when I started reading the book, and it's something I appreciate in it.
I wish I had my old sketchbook, because I took an intro to drawing class my last year in college when I was a graduate student even. I just had this room in my schedule and I took one, and everybody else was, drawing. They had, the teacher had us, drawing from animals at the museum, the Natural History Museum. So they were stuffed creatures, and everyone else was doing that. And I'm drawing these Rosharan creatures and things very poorly. I wish I had them to embarrass myself to show you my original drawings. I'm so glad that I didn't have to put my drawings in the books, because this was back before I got published, when I wasn't sure if I would ever be able to sell this series because it was so weird and so long. And so it would be nice to show those, but I don't have those anymore. They were really embarrassing. It would have been a great thing to have.
All right. Well, let's talk about those first two covers that you did a little bit, just because one of the things that the storms carve the landscape of Roshar. They're almost they're a character unto themselves, and they're portrayed very well, especially on the first two covers, almost as an extra character. There's these storms that take up so much space. And how did you create those? What kind of reference did you use? How did you go about painting the storms on those first two covers?
Well, that was my sense reading the book too, is that the character of the weather systems was such an important uniting force to the plot that I felt it had to be well represented in the cover. I'd say at least half of what ended up on that painting came from my own personal experience. When I was growing up, my family moved almost every year. So I went to, I think, 8 elementary schools, 3 junior highs, and 4 high schools. But anyway, during one of these moves, we were moving from California to Colorado, to Denver. And on June 15th through 16th, in 1965, we were driving up Route 25, I believe it was, in between Pueblo and Colorado Springs. And I looked out the window of the car and I saw the darkest cloud I'd ever seen in my life. It literally looked like a wad of cotton that had been dipped in black Indian ink in the sky. And I knew something bad was going to happen from it. And the torrential downpours that came from this weather system knocked out several dams and caused the Platte River to flood and wipe out the whole center of downtown Denver. So we came into a disaster zone when we moved into Denver, or Littleton, later that evening. But while we were there on the highway, all the traffic stopped, and we were pelted for quite a long period of time with hail that was the size of golf balls, or between golf ball and softball size. Huge hailstones, and it hammered all the cars in the highway, and they all looked like someone had gone over them with a sledgehammer. And that left a very deep impression on me. And during the subsequent 2 years I was living in Denver, I saw 5 tornadoes and some amazing storm systems. I'd grown up in California, so clouds almost were either a gray sky or a blue sky. You know, I hardly ever saw anything that would be characterized as a good thunderhead formation during my whole growing up period. And that was all changed when I was in Colorado, and I was constantly looking at the sky and being fascinated by the shapes of the clouds and these huge storm fronts and storm systems full of lightning that would come rolling over the Rocky Mountains and over Denver and then go out into Kansas and heading east. So I couldn't help but draw upon that experience when I was trying to visualize these high storms, you know, on Roshar. The funny thing about nature is, though, whatever you come up with in your head, when you start Googling things like storm fronts or gust fronts and start looking at pictures, you realize that nature can outdo your imagination 9 times out of 10. And after I had done the painting, I started building up a library of pictures of storm fronts. And there's some magnificent photography out there done both by amateurs and professionals for people like National Geographic. And I think some of that information was definitely in my head when I was doing the second cover, Words of Radiance. And I wanted to give the clouds and the swirling action of the elements in the sky a sense of movement and animation that, you know, you can't do it in a 2-dimensional piece that's not animated, but I wanted to create that feeling anyway with the curves that are happening all around in the sky.
You know, one of the things I really liked about the first cover, which I own, I don't know if it's in the shot, but it's hanging above the hearth here that we're sitting next to. I really like your landscapes, because a lot of the landscapes you've done in the past just really have this interesting character to them. My favorite of them is the Dark Tower painting, where the tower is almost like a glowing cross, where there's light coming down and hitting it and things like this. One of my just favorite of your paintings. And I know, you know, I mean, obviously you're well known for figures and for your dragons and fantastical creatures and things like this. And, you know, I have multiples of those paintings hanging in my house. But something about that Dark Tower landscape really evoked how powerful the tower is and how different. It's almost monolithic, like 2001. And things like this. And when I got the Way of Kings cover in, it had that same character, where it's like a lot of people paint a landscape as static, and you paint a landscape as full of motion, life, and power. And it really struck me. It's that's the one I had to buy, just because it feels like it's moving. It feels like it's alive, despite being a landscape.
Oh, well, the descriptions of the shattered plains is so evocative. I could spend a long time there doing lots of other paintings. There was a movie running in my head while I was reading all those descriptive passages in the book, and I found myself doing sketch after sketch in black and white or monochrome acrylics of different aspects of the shattered plains, because it's so wonderfully evocative. I love the whole idea of these deep chasms and the trenches and life living in the cracks in between these plates on this gigantic plain of battle. It's just one of the most compelling fantasy landscapes or environments that I've ever read in my life. So how could I not be influenced by that? It was terrific.
It's really interesting that you brought up also Denver, because I grew up in Nebraska, right there in the Midwest, and the thunderstorms in the Midwest are just epic. It's one of the few things I miss moving to Utah, because in general, the weather in Utah is way nicer. It's not nearly as muggy. It's not frozen cold in the winter. You know, it's just, but we don't have those storms. And I've never really thought about how those Midwestern storms really shaped how I ended up painting, or not painting, writing The Way of Kings.
Yeah, and you can see them because there are fewer mountains and tall fir trees and everything to obscure
Yeah.
your vision of the sky. When I know when I've been hiking in Montana or Wyoming, and I'm in an area where there's a wide view like that. It's just wonderful to just sit there and watch the sky and see how it develops. It's quite different from living here in the East Coast where there's trees everywhere, and it's more difficult to. I have to get to a football field or something to really get a good view of what's going on in the sky.
So let's move on to the latest painting that you've done for the Stormlight Archive. We have been hearing feedback from fans, and of course here at Dragonsteel, we love the cover that you've done for Rhythm of War. A lot of the fans are calling it their favorite illustration so far. Do you have a favorite cover, or one that you've enjoyed the process on more than others?
I think my favorite was The Way of Kings, because I felt like the painting was such a perfect expression of my infatuation with the book, and the series, and it just kind of poured out of me almost unconsciously. And well, I shouldn't say that. It was very deliberate, but it my enthusiasm for this new world and this host of wonderful characters that just kind of lit up my imagination and my energy level, so that I felt it's all there on the canvas, so to speak. The something that I've developed a feeling for over the years. I feel like with a really epic book that it's sometimes a mistake to actually try to paint a portrait or a face of a character that's going to be a big fan favorite, because people have such divergent ideas of what a particular hero or heroine looks like. And if you try to nail it down, and you're invariably not going to hit the mark for some readers. It may be a small percentage or a large percentage, but still you're trying to define something that's a very personal interpretation on the part of the various, the thousands of readers of the book. And I remember when I did the cover to the last Gunslinger book, I regretted as soon as it came out on the stands and I saw it, I said, oh, I wish I hadn't painted his face. I should have turned his face in the shadow and made it more enigmatic so people could kind of fill in the blank. And with The Way of Kings, he's facing away from you, so you're free to characterize him the way that you feel is best for the book. I tried as hard as I could in the subsequent volumes that I've done to do the best job I could in illustrating the characters, but I'm aware of the fact that it's not going to be 100%, and so that colors my feeling about the success of the paintings to a certain degree. But another thing about The Way of Kings is that it was so different from other paintings that I'd done. I'd never started a painting by working on it in pastels first. Well, I did one way back, a cover for Arkham House back in 1980, but that was a different story. But in this case, I just threw all caution to the winds and didn't really have a working procedure. I stood in front of this big blank board and said, you know what? I got to put up as much color and movement and clouds into this painting as quickly as I can. And I couldn't think of a faster way of doing it than to get out these pastel chalks, which I could put on and apply color broadside and smear with my hands. So I had pastel all over me when after I had worked in all the cloud shapes and had the basic shapes of the landscape on the bottom done. But it felt very, what's the word? Subjective, and I felt I had my whole body into the painting process. Whereas I think the other paintings I've done were more cerebral and finicky, and had less of that sense of throwing everything into the initial part of the procedure. So for that and other reasons, I guess that first book will remain my favorite.
We really love The Way of Kings too, and of all the covers, it's just really hard to pick a favorite because they But we are very pleased with all of them, and this latest one is very nice.
One of the reasons I like this latest one is it feels like reminds me very much of the Melanie Ron books that I read growing up, where like Sky Bowl is my favorite of those covers, those are mostly portraits, and one of the reasons I became a writer was because of these books I was reading, but coincidentally, you guys probably all know the story already. All three of the first fantasy series I read were Michael Whelan covers, and I was just drawn to them. It's what grabbed me. And those Melanie Ron books, the Sunrunner books, also are kind of formative in how I view building magic systems with a logic to them and things. And this cover reminds me a lot of those Melanie Ron, those Sunrunner books that I just still to this day, I have Skyball hanging up in my house is one of my favorite covers. And this has the same sort of powerful colors that one does, and kind of an explosion of color, and the really dynamic figures from kind of that 90s Michael Whelan cover painting era. And so it feels really cool to me for that reason.
Yeah, those are a lot of fun to do. And I love the visuals of Shadesmar. Am I pronouncing it correctly?
I say Shadesmar, so yeah. Mm-hmm.
And I want to revisit it. I have some concept sketches, a lot of comps I did for the book cover are only semi-finished or partially finished, and I definitely want to go in there and tidy them up so that they offer me a more complete exploration of the view that I had and the different alternatives that I came up with. It's a marvelous mental construction, and the visuals are just mind-boggling. It's almost too much to handle.
Yeah, it was the toughest thing of working with illustrators, Isaac and I have talked about, is the fact that we get these brilliant concepts sent in that we have to choose among and say, maybe this one, and you'll do this, you'll send us 10 different versions of what the cover could be, and they're all incredible, and we're like, how do we choose this? This is crazy. It's the hardest part, Isaac has said, of his job, is picking and knowing that the other 8 he's not going to get to see.
Yeah. I love that, the Dragon Steel editions of your Mistborn books, and how they include so many different cover versions in them so that fans can see the UK edition and the Chinese edition, and they're all valid and they're all beautiful and wonderful. So how would one choose between one and the other? But it's great seeing the variety. I think it's just such a treat. They're really beautiful volumes, so well produced, and I love seeing the artwork. I've been a fan of John Foster's and Chris McGrath and Sam Weber especially. I mean, he's just phenomenal, and they all have their own unique vision and what's the word? Different ways of emphasizing different aspects of a story, and it's wonderful to see them visualized and presented in a volume that people can buy and look at.
Well, we, like I said, we love that you were able to visit Shadesmar in this book on the cover. We almost had Shadesmar on book 3 because we sent 2 concepts to Tor, the one of Yasna that we have, and the other one was traveling in Shadesmar. And ultimately, Tor chose the cover with Yasna, and so we were very much wanting for this book to go to Shadesmar and show the environment there. And I think it's great that we get that. We've had a couple with the Shattered Plains on the cover. We've had Thelana, and then going into this new environment, I think is great. And symbolically, I don't know if you intended this, but when we look at the front of the cover here, it's kind of divided in half between, here's this part of Shalon, and then we see the distant sun of Shadesmar with the beautiful cloudscape. But there's that dichotomy that kind of is reminiscent of here's the physical world, here's the cognitive world, and
Yes.
it sort of encapsulates what Shadesmar is to Roshar. That's
Yeah.
something that I don't know was intentional, but it reads really well and looks really cool on the cover.
Thank you. I when I do the concept sketches, I've taken to lately to painting them on scraps of canvas, so that I can put them on a copy of one of your books, like Oathbringer, and wrap it around like it's a dust cover, and I can see what ends up on the front and what's on the spine and what's on the back, and I try to compose it so that it works, with how it's going to wrap around the book cover.
Can you show us that a little better? Adam says that people might enjoy having a better view of that. No, not that, the canvas that you held up.
Here's Oathbringer, and here's one of the comps. And you can see that's got a fold in it because I did do this. I put it on the book and I wrapped it around the book. And I fold it like that. And so on this version, I didn't put the figures in on this concept, but I've got ones that do, and
Is that the actual painting that you're folding?
What's that?
Is that an actual painting that you're folding?
Yeah.
You just painted it at the exact same size.
Yeah, it's just painted on canvas.
That's amazing. That's great.
I got tons of them.
Oh.
But there's so many choices to be made. As evocative as your narratives are, when you think of things like crystalline plants, in an environment like Shadesmar, there's so many ways you can interpret that, and I went down this incredible rabbit hole pretty much at the beginning of this project, trying to visualize what the plants would look like. And I've got all kinds of sketches. I probably have 5 different interpretations of how the plants look. And I've got ones that look kind of like Dale Chihuly sculptures. Have you seen those glass sculptures that kind of look like underwater plants? And I've got other ones that are more crystalline and they have pointy edges and look kind of like weeds that you see in a field that have rime frost on them. I've got other ones, but the rabbit hole I went down was playing around with fractal design programs on my computer, and I love fractal branchings, and so I started to develop all kinds of fractal patterns that I thought would make interesting foliage patterns for the cover. And oh my, I lost weeks playing around with this fractal design program, and I've got a whole bunch of fractal paintings of fractal plant shapes, but I don't know if they'll ever come into use or not, but it was a lot of fun.
I really like that you used the fractal as a metaphor on the cover, and that the plants grow like that. It's interesting. One of the ways I talk about world building with people is I talk about world building being like a fractal, and obviously they've shown up in my books in some of the characters like pattern and things. The reason I use it for world building is I say good world building is like a fractal in that you can step back and get a picture of it, just kind of a large-scale picture and get a feel for it. But those readers who want to dig deeply can look closer and closer and closer at the world building and find more and more that's really interesting and fascinating and detailed. And it's I feel like good world building does this because what it allows is those fans that don't want to get lost in the details don't get intimidated by the amount of world building, but those fans who want to dig really deeply can look really deep and find that it works and it connects all together on the small scale. And so that's one of my my guiding principles is don't overwhelm the casual fan, but also have for the person who digs really deeply, lots more complexity there. And so the fractals have popped up now and again in my books as a theme. In fact, the map of Roshar is based off of a fractal that I once saw an imagery of a fractal that was moving and growing and shaping of the Julius set, and that is where I got the idea, like for the shape of the world was based off of that.
That's awesome. I think that's very evident in your writing. You can look at something small like a Kremlin or one of those little rock plants, rock buds, and that kind of is Roshar in a nutshell, so to speak, because the idea of a plant needing to protect itself and shield itself and yet being able to open up and blossom when conditions permit, it says so much about the large view of what the planet's all about. So I think that's brilliant.
One of the most exciting moments for me was when we were working on that first book and we'd seen a draft that didn't have the rock buds on it, but then you saw Ben's artwork that was going in the book, and you're like, wait, I got to add these things in. And you went and you added the rock buds into the first cover and sent it back to him and said, all right, now it's done, which I just loved when that happened.
And it really helped the picture. It did a lot to enhance the composition. So it was a win-win all the way around.
Well, I think because of that, that's kind of molded how we do approach these covers, that this time around we just involved Ben McSweeney and you from the beginning, and once we knew kind of where the cover was going to take place, we had Ben start doing some concepts that then we ran through Brandon, and Brandon gave his feedback on that, and then we sent to you as well as, here's some of Ben's concepts that you can kind of play within this space for some of the clothing and some of the other things that show up on the cover.
Yeah, you had Ben send me some really rough thumbnail sketches of possible cover layouts, and that really helped me to focus on what had to be included. You know what I mean? We wanted Shalon and Adolin, on the cover, and try to get the fortress in there and make it all work so that even with all the type and everything on the cover, the fans would be able to visualize what was happening as they were reading the book. And, it helps speed the process up and eliminate, for me, exploring false avenues that aren't going to be productive. So it's, that it was great. I really appreciate having all that input. And I always tell people that I work with that give me all the input you can, because I'm trying to do something that's going to please a lot of people, and it's really important to me as a fan to be as accurate as possible. And I make mistakes, and I just soon prevent myself from doing so if possible.
Going back to working with you and Ben a little bit. That process kind of goes both ways. For example, when Ben finally saw your cover picture and your interpretation of the tower on the back, he then had to go and take your version of the tower and draw it on one of the Shalon sketchbook pages so that it was harmonious between the two. So that road goes both ways, artists influencing artists and going back and forth like that, which is kind of a cool thing.
I love that fortress, that tower, and those scenes inside it are just so compelling. I can't wait to see someone illustrate some scenes from inside that wacky environment. It's so cool. It's I read it and my mouth was just dropping open. I said, "This is so awesome," and I felt. Well, I shouldn't say disappointed that, but it's so far in the distance on the cover that there's no surface texture showing. And I realized that there was some confusion when there was a cover reveal and fans are saying, "What is this, a monolith or a big stone thing?" Or, it's hard to tell what the heck it's going to be. But it's good to have some mystery there so that people have to read the book to find out what's going on.
Yeah, it is. It actually, he's talking about that. I hadn't realized this, but some of those scenes that I'm writing, I remember from your Art of Michael Whelan book, some of your fine art pictures that were just surfaces of like giant walls with like a little person or a little mark on it, kind of the immensity of some structure and a really small person juxtaposed, is one of those images that's burned into my head from some of your fine artwork. And I don't know if I was inspired by that or not, but talking about it reminds me of those things.
Yeah. Well, there's a lot of synchronicity going on with these projects.
So we're talking about your process, and you do a lot of sketches. You were talking about you sketch in your sketchbook for the cover. You're doing these paintings that wrap around the book itself. Lots of concept art. Do you ever just, and when you get into it, and maybe it's a false avenue or maybe not, but you just find yourself lost in the act of creation on some of these
Absolutely
preliminary pieces?
It happens all the time. It's happening now. Let me see. I've got character sketches, that I do. Once I know where I'm going with the layout and the landscape, then I'll do drawings in a whatever sketchbook I'm using at the time. Let me see. And I'll sketch out different poses of the characters that are going to be in the cover. But there's so many ways that they can be posed, and so I can't really. I'm so wishy-washy. I can't make up my mind until I actually get around to doing a painting of the character in a pose. So that was one pose. That was another one. And these are just scraps of board that I've painted in acrylics on. And, I'll pick the one that I think works for the cover. And then this board here would be my model when I'm doing the painting. Basically, I put this in front of me, and that's my model. And so I did a monochrome version of the pose that Shalon's in. I changed it somewhat in the actual painting. I think her feet are further apart, and it's a little more dramatic. But it was originally done just all in sepia tones, but I like the painting and I love the character so much that I wanted to go in there and add some color. So I'm doing that just for myself because I want to see how she looks in full color rather than as a monochrome sketch. And I find myself doing this a lot with, especially with some of the preliminary things. And I may take some time, maybe in January, to do a painting or a drawing, at least, of the inside of that fortress, that huge tower, because I found the imagery so compelling that it's just irresistible.
We would love to see that. We have yet to see visualizations of that, and to see something like that from you, I think we would just love to get lost in.
Well, I get asked in interviews at times, do I ever find myself bereft of ideas and short of ideas? And my God, how could just The Way of Kings or Oathbringer or any of these books, there's a painting idea on every page in the book. How can any illustrator or artist ever be wanting for ideas for paintings? Just that whole section on Shadesmar and inside the fortress and Aelin going up the top, walking up the inside edge of this thing and going around the top and looking down. The mind reels at some of the visual possibilities in these books. So, there's enough visual inspiration in this one volume of, Rhythm of War to inspire me for the rest of my life. So, it's it's a wonderful thing. I don't mean to go on gushing so much, but it really is.
Well, it's really an artistic thing too. Like, I'm always baffled by that question when people say, "What do you run out of ideas? Are you worried?" And I'm like, you don't understand. The great tragedy of an artist's life is knowing that you will not be able to do half of the projects or more that you want to do, right? The children that you have to abandon to vanish away to dust and die because you will never be able to give them any attention is the great tragedy of a writer's life, right? We just, the other day, we're talking about, someone asked on my live stream, oh, how many books do you have outlined that you haven't been able to write? And I was able to come up with about 15 that I went in my file and pulled out. And I know most of those I will not be able to write. Some of those are from 8-10 years ago that I outlined and haven't been able to find a time for yet. And so, yeah, we don't run out of ideas. It's the other way around. We run out of time to do the things we want to do.
I know. Well, yeah, when people ask me the same question, all I do is show them my file drawers in my studio. I've got 2 lateral files that are 4 feet wide, and they're full of legal size hanging file folders, and each one is a painting concept set. And I've got 2 drawers full of, and some of these things I've been carrying around in my head for decades. And, I say, well, hopefully I'll get to them someday. But, one of the questions that I get asked in interviews is, what am I planning to do next after such and such a project? And that's really a hard question to answer, because when I find myself with some time to do something just on my own, out of these file drawers and ideas that are flowing into my head, it's really hard for me to decide what feels most important, or what should I devote my time to. I've got X number of days or X number of weeks to devote to doing a piece of artwork. Which one feels more important? And it's a difficult decision to make. I usually end up having to cover our kitchen table with sketches and concepts and show them to Audrey and say, well, what am I supposed to do now? Give me some direction here. So.
Well, that's a good segue, because we were going to ask you what's next. I mean, you've been working on Fahrenheit 451 for the Ray Bradbury re-release, and you've been working on Rhythm of War.
Have you announced what project you're working on next?
No. I know what I'm going to be doing for a while is doing more Stormlight illustrations. I'd really like to take some of the concepts that that weren't able to make it onto the book and develop them at least as monochrome paintings. I'll be working on those for the next month or so. And I've got some concepts I did for Fahrenheit 451 that really cry out to be finished. And so I'm going to finish them. They'll be in a small format. They won't be like a regular full-blown painting, but I've got to see where they go, because I think they have a lot of possibilities in them. After that, I've got 5 or 6 unfinished projects that are on easels or in drawers in my studio that have been waiting for me to get to them and finish them. And it's driving me nuts that I haven't been able to do it, but their time will come. I'll get around to doing it during the winter. And then after that, I've got a whole new series of paintings that I'm starting with symbols that I haven't used yet that I'm really excited about developing. I spent a couple of weeks defining the whole symbol set and what I want to do with the paintings and how big I want them to be. And that's something I'm going to jump into with both feet at the beginning of next year. So there's a lot coming up that I feel really excited about.
Well, those excite me as well. I know that you're talking about gushing about Brandon's books, but I know that both of us here are withholding gushing about your paintings and your art, because they were formative for me in getting me into fantasy books and into going into art. I didn't go into the painting side of things, but so just hearing what you have coming up is very exciting to both of us. So one of the things that I've noticed with in a lot of interviews that people give you is they ask about your process, and you say something along the lines of, my process is different for every painting. And I find that interesting. Is that My interpretation of that is that you're always pushing yourself to do things differently or look at something from another way, and to just keep yourself invigorated creatively. Can you talk about that a little bit, about how your process is really a different process every time?
Yeah, it's not efficient, that's for sure. But going into this career had nothing to do with being efficient or um, thinking of it as a way to make a living. Though fortunately it turned out that way for me. But the whole idea for me was to keep it fun, and part of uh, making sure that it stays fun for me is uh, trying to avoid having a situation where I feel like I'm just cranking something out or where I'm repeating myself. And I hate to repeat myself. If possible, I try to find a new solution to a visual problem every time a book is presented to me. And so I allow myself the freedom to choose a media or whatever that I feel suits my emotional reaction to the book. So when The Way of Kings came my way, and it came time for me to do this painting, though I haven't used pastels in the painting before, it just felt right. So I gave myself the allowance. I allowed myself, or gave myself the freedom to use whatever medium I felt was appropriate to start the whole process, and it worked out fine. Sometimes it doesn't. Sometimes it causes problems, and I've got to backtrack and redo things, and that's a problem when it happens. But it keeps it fresh for me and exciting, and feeling like I'm walking a tightrope a little bit on what I'm doing, and hopefully coming out with something that keeps my interest in what I do. So I don't know. In this case, for Rhythms of War, it was falling into the world of fractals that gave it a fresh a feeling of freshness and working with something new. And it led to problems in some respects because I tried to shoehorn fractal patterns into places where I didn't feel they ended up working well, and I had to backtrack and move away from that a little bit. But it's still something that I want to explore, and I'm definitely going to get into them with some of the concept sketches that I'm going to develop a little bit further, just to see where it takes me. But that's keeping the fun in it for me.
One of the things that I appreciated when we had our back and forth on the cover, and Ben and I were creating those little grayscale thumbnails for you, one of the things that you came back with that it kind of stuck with me was, as you were looking at those thumbnails, you were saying, I've already done a painting like this, or I've already painted Shalon from this angle. And being able to, like you said, not fall into the rut, but find a fresh way to do that. That is one of the points of wisdom that I feel like has stuck into my head from this process, that I hope to be able to go forward with and try to see things in a new light, the way that you are with each project. So I appreciate that approach quite a bit.
Yeah, I think it pays dividends in the final result. People are uh, happier with something that doesn't feel like it's been mass produced, or done as a job. It's for me, it's an opportunity, not an assignment. I think the closest word I can think of for what I'm doing for publishers or in efforts like this is a commission. But there's so much freedom involved with working on these projects that uh, I don't know. It just maintains a level of joy and excitement in the whole process that I hope comes through in the artwork, and uh, results in something that people find a lot of excitement and enjoyment in.
I think it does. I think you've proven over the years that this process that you have is working for you, and it's working for a lot of viewers. So I think we're kind of getting close to being able to wrap this up. We kind of wanted to keep it at about this time amount. But in the end, if there's anything that you would like to say to kind of wrap up this segment, from you, Brandon, and also from
What one thing I'd like to know: do you have prints of this book for sale yet? Will fans be able to buy it next week if they want a print of Rhythm of War?
Oh, this was so freaking hard to print. Man, because the blacks are so black, and they're actually not black. They're a mixture of, well, carbon black and purple, and a special mixture I made using alizarin crimson and sap green and a special blue that I get from a paint company. And there's a richness to it that it was so hard to duplicate. But I had a huge breakthrough yesterday, and I finally came out with a proof print that looks, to me, dead on, close to the painting. So I can answer yes. If you had asked me this yesterday, I would have been waffling. But yes, the prints are finally proofed out, and beginning late today, early tomorrow, we'll be able to get the prints run off, and they will be available. Yes.
Awesome. So people who are seeing this right now can go to michaelwhelan.com and get copies. And we'll post a link to that.
Yeah, thanks. There's something I want to say, and that's one avenue that I've had to pursue in my studying up on Shadesmar, for example, and reacquainting myself with the environment was I went to the different wikis, the Dragonsteel, not Dragonsteel, the Stormlight wiki archives, and that gave me an opportunity to see some of the fan art that's being done, inspired by your books, and it's fantastic. And some of it's too damn good. I found myself really challenged by some of the visualizations of Shadesmar and the foliage there. And man, there's some really good artists out there who are doing exciting work, and it's thrilling. And it's thrilling to see these scores of people that are inspired by this writing and the environments you create, and to see what they've come up with. And I think the volume of artwork, both on the professional level and on a fan art level, that has arisen from, it's to me like a garden of infinite delights that have come out of this series. So it's been a revelation for me and a challenge as well. So I just want to make sure I got a mention of that in there, that how much I appreciate the work that the fans are doing, based on what Brandon has been writing. It's been wonderful.
All right. Well, Michael, thank you for your time today. And Brandon, thanks for being here as well. This has been a fun conversation.
It's been a real pleasure.
Yeah, it's been great getting to work with you directly. It's one of the highlights of my art career is getting to work with you, and so it's just been a lot of fun. And thank you for taking the time today.
We've kept it fun, and it's all fun and it's exciting. Yet there's a depth to the story and the characterizations at a level that I think speak to people with widely varied experiences. So it's fun, but it's meaningful. And that for me is a tangent point that I think is something that's rare in our industry or our field of artistic endeavor that will, I think, last in perpetuity and be something that people will look back on with a great deal of respect and appreciation.
Thank you, Michael.
Thank you.
Thanks a lot.
Yep.
Great talking to you.
You take care. Have a great weekend.
Yeah, you too.